Dr. Lee is the David and Patricia Giuliani and Ollie Press Endowed Chair for Cancer Research and Professor at the University of Washington and Fred Hutch. She's an NIH-funded clinical investigator whose research interests include health services and outcomes research, quality of life and patient-reported outcomes, and allogeneic hematopoietic cell transplantation with a special interest in chronic graft-versus-host disease, also known as GVHD. She is the principal investigator of the Chronic GVHD Consortium, a group of 10 institutions that collaborate to conduct observational and therapeutic trials of chronic GVHD. Dr. Lee also holds a number of leadership roles, including Associate Director of the Clinical Research Division and the Research Director of the Transplant Long-Term Follow-Up Program at Fred Hutch. She is also the past 2020 President of the American Society of Hematology. Dr. Lee is speaking today on themes related to the PHS required topic of conflict of interest with the title Avoiding COI, Morbidity, and Mortality. And I will turn it over to you, Dr. Lee.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you everybody for attending. I will say that this is not the type of talk that I normally give, and so it took me quite a while to put this together, but it was actually fun to delve into this, and I tried to think about this topic in a little different way, so hopefully you will enjoy it. So here are our learning objectives, and if you're looking at the screen and some of it's cut off, apparently that only happens with this first slide, and then it should get better. So at the end of this session, I hope that we have learned the following things. First, to understand the difference between conflict of interest and conflict of commitment, and to give examples of regulated and unregulated conflicts. Second, to know why correct disclosure and management of conflicts is important for your career. And third, to identify third-party approaches that can assist with COI oversight and reporting. And throughout this talk and our discussion, I'm going to make the assumption that people want to do the right thing. Sometimes it's just very complicated. So here's our agenda. I'm going to start off with a historical perspective to talk about why conflict of interest is so important. Then we'll talk about definitions and current policies. We'll then review conflict of interest risks to your career and mitigation strategies that you can use. I then have 10 examples, and we can get through as many or as few of those as we have time for. And then I do want to save a lot of time at the end for questions. So I hope to have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And as Karen said, please put your questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll get to them. So here are my conflicts of interest. These are only my financial conflicts of interest. I have funding from a number of pharmaceutical companies to do research in chronic graft-versus-host disease and other topics. I don't think that any of these is really material to this talk. Other than that, I have experience with conflict of interest. So why is this important? Why is conflict of interest important in medical research, education, and practice? So here I'm just showing you a picture of the report from the National Academies of Science that was published in 2009, in which they really talked about why conflict of interest is meaningful, why it's important, and why it exists. I think there's also a tension, which this report acknowledges, between the good of conflict of interest and some of the adverse effects of it. And so I'll just read this for you. It says, patients and the public benefit when physicians and researchers collaborate with pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotechnology companies to develop products that benefit individuals and public health. At the same time, concerns are growing that wide-ranging financial ties to industry may unduly influence professional judgments involving the primary interests and goals of medicine. Such conflicts of interest threaten the integrity of scientific investigations, the objectivity of professional education, the quality of patient care, and the public's trust in medicine. And so I think this is the tension. Obviously, it's very important, is how are we going to translate our discoveries into actual things that get to patients. On the other hand, sometimes this conflict can be bad. And it's important to realize that this is really only something that's been going on, I think, in medicine in probably the last 40 years. So before 1980, the federal government held the interests of all of the research that was done with its funding. And so if you were funded by the NIH and made a discovery, you really couldn't commercialize that yourself. However, in 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act allowed investigators and institutions to take the research that was created under federally funded projects and actually commercialize it. And it's important to realize that this was done because it was felt that a lot of research was not making it out of the labs into actual practice because that sort of translation wasn't going on. And so this was really a change to try to fix what was a problem in the field. Fortunately, when that happened, a lot of conflicts began to take place. And in 1995, there were the first PHS, National Science Foundation conflict of interest rules. So why is there conflict of interest? Well, we all have primary professional obligations as investigators. We are supposed to conduct unbiased research that moves the scientific enterprise forward. We have to protect the rights and well-being of research participants, and we need to give accurate and timely sharing of research results. On the other hand, these professional obligations conflict with some of our secondary goals, which include sometimes personal financial gain, research funding. If you are an investigator, you need to keep yourself funded, your lab funded, your research program going. And also there's the pursuit of professional recognition. So promotion, tenure, publication, and awards. All of these secondary goals can interfere and bias your professional obligations. So what are the types of conflicts we're going to discuss? Well, the major one we're going to discuss is what's called a conflict of interest, or COI. This is a situation in which financial or other personal considerations have the potential to compromise or bias professional judgment and objectivity. It includes interests of your spouse and domestic partner and your dependent children. And it's important to realize that it's defined by whether a conflict is present, not whether an investigator's actions are biased. So a lot of people say, well, I have a conflict, but I'm not biased by that. It doesn't matter, you still have a conflict. Another important conflict is what's called a conflict of commitment. This is a situation in which time dedicated to outside professional activities exceeds what is allowed by institutional policies because it interferes with your commitment to your primary job and your primary institution. So we'll talk a little bit about this, but again, most of the focus is going to be on conflict of interest. So here are some examples of regulated conflicts. So these are recognized conflicts that you have to report and that everybody sort of understands. In terms of conflict of interest, it would include things such as payment for consulting, for travel, advisory boards, expert witness, speaker fees, and other income. It specifically excludes government and academic institutions. So if you serve on an NIH study section or you go to another institution and give grand rounds, that actually does not count. Conflict of interest includes ownership interests, so things like stock and stock options. It does exclude mutual funds, retirement funds, things over which you really don't have control in what those funds are invested in. Intellectual property rights are conflicts of interest, leadership positions such as director, trustee, or officer, and any foreign support. In terms of conflict of commitment, this is usually based on time. And so more than 10 to 20% effort on paid or unpaid outside activities is considered a conflict of commitment. Fred Hutch, it's 10%, University of Washington, it's 20%. This excludes time that's given to federal agencies, so again, serving on that NIH study section, or nonprofit professional associations. You could also have a conflict of commitment if you do something to jeopardize institutional intellectual property. If you inappropriately use your institutional resources, such as your office, your lab space, your administrative support, or if you assign trainees to work on outside projects. And these conflicts of interest have to be declared when you're first hired, if you obtain a new conflict, at the time of grant submission or award, and then annually. Now, I also want to recognize some unregulated conflicts. What are unregulated conflicts of interest? Well, promoting one's work, institution, or mentees inappropriately, disparaging others because of past interactions or personal gain. So talking up your mentee without acknowledging that they're your mentee can be inappropriate. Also, being especially hard on that paper because the results might conflict with some of your findings. Those are conflicts of interest. Delaying positive publication to secure patents or prevent competition, or delaying negative publication to prevent adverse effects on a for-profit company. And enrolling patients on a clinical trial that has a higher reimbursement rate than another clinical trial. Those are all examples of conflicts of interest. A conflict of commitment can occur if you give inappropriate priority to outside professional interest, even if it's not more than 10 or 20% of your time. So if you give inappropriate attention, focus, or public comments, that can be a conflict of commitment. And these are not officially reported. You just have to be aware of them and avoid them if possible. What is strongly discouraged or not allowed? Well, you're discouraged for being an executive officer or on the board of directors of a for-profit company. Under some extraordinary circumstances, you can have these roles, but mostly these are strongly discouraged. What is not allowed? What's not allowed is when a research result is required for payment, paid endorsement of a commercial product, being on the board of directors of a for-profit company if you're a founder or a co-founder. Founders and co-founders have some extra restrictions placed on them. Speakers bureaus, which used to be very common when I was in residency, are really not used very much anymore. And ghostwriting. This is when a medical writing company writes your paper and then is not acknowledged. If it is acknowledged, then it's not considered ghostwriting. So what do we do with these conflicts? Because I'm sure you probably have recognized some of the things for yourself in those lists of conflicts. Well, let's start on the right. For prohibited financial interest, these are things for which there really is no mitigation and you're not allowed to engage in human subjects involvement. This would be if you have more than $10,000 in annual income, and this includes travel with the company that's sponsoring the research. If you have any ownership, so that's stock options, partnership interests in the company that's sponsoring the human subjects research, or if you have IP, which includes patents, licensing agreements, royalties, copyrights, or trademarks. In all of these circumstances, you're really not supposed to have any human subjects involvement, which means being the PI or the co-PI of a protocol, or even consenting and treating or determining endpoints on patients who are on research protocols. If you have less than this, but you're still conflicted, we call that a significant financial interest that's displayed on the other side. And the solution for this is a conflict management plan. This would be needed if you had between $5,000 and $10,000 in aggregate annual income, which includes travel, which adds up quickly, and IP, or equity in a public company, or if you have any amount of equity in a privately held company. Okay, so why is conflict of interest so important? Well, because COI, if it interferes with your primary responsibilities, can cause serious adverse events. And what are these? Well, it can compromise unbiased research. It could interfere with the duty of beneficence to patients. What the duty of beneficence means is that you are always doing the best for your patient. You're not influenced by outside and external considerations. If you have significant COI, it can cast doubt on results and conclusions of your studies. It can tarnish the reputation of investigators and institutions, and it increases skepticism and reduces public support for science. All of these things are the adverse effects of conflict of interest. Okay, so what about your career? And it's a little tongue in cheek, but I'm trying to equate some of these concepts of COI to things that we commonly deal with in medicine. So here's the Center for Diseases Control and Prevention, MMWR, Morbidity and Mortality weekly report. And if we think of COI and its impact on you as an investigator, it can result in career morbidity, which I would define as loss of personal reputation, either among your colleagues or in your field or even publicly. It can result in loss or inability to apply for funding, loss of opportunities. If you want to be on a guidelines panel, sometimes if you have conflicts, you're not allowed to serve on that panel. And perhaps not always recognized, there can be loss of productivity and academic career momentum due to distractions that are your conflicts. Can also result in career mortality. There are examples of people who were terminated for conflict of interest. You can also have FDA disqualification, which means you're not allowed to be an investigator on anything related to the FDA. Okay, so one of the criteria that's always used for conflict of interest is that you don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times. You don't want it to look bad enough to be there. So I wanted to show you some headlines from the New York Times. I don't think it was the front page, but are things that are related to conflict of interest. But here's one of these. What these medical journals don't reveal, top doctors' ties to industry. So this was published in 2018, and it was an expose on a number of leading key opinion leaders who had not disclosed their conflicts when they published journal articles, including in things like the New England Journal of Medicine. Made a big splash. There's a lot of negative publicity for these investigators and for their institutions. They had to disclose. Some of them actually had to step down and resign. Also at an institutional level, here's another headline: Memorial Sloan Kettering leaders violated conflict of interest rules, the report finds. So not only failure to disclose in terms of publications, but also in terms of getting prior approvals and oversight of those conflicts. And again, this led to resignations. So maybe you're not directing an institute or publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine, but you might be interested in serving on a guidelines panel, for example. And here's an example of a headline that says, study finds conflicts among panel's doctors. Right now, it's pretty stringent who can serve on a guidelines panel. And for some institutions, for some organizations, there's a zero tolerance policy. So if you have any conflict, you're not allowed to serve. Now, I mentioned the tension between commercializing or getting, our discoveries out to patients and conflicts. I think there's also a conflict within ourselves, and that was discussed in this article entitled Doctors' Magical Thinking About Conflicts of Interest. A lot of us think that we're not affected by these conflicts. However, studies show that conflicted people do behave in apparently biased ways. I guess that's not surprising, but there actually are hard data for that. Also interesting is that we all believe that we're not influenced by conflicts, but we actually believe that other people are. So we may not feel like our conflict of interest is changing anything that we do, but when we hear about our colleagues who has a conflict of interest, we think that maybe they might be acting in a biased manner. And multiple studies show that patients and the public are suspicious of financial conflicts and gifts. Okay, so now again, switching back to the medical paradigm, if we think of conflict of interest as a condition, what can we do about it? Well, on the prevention end, you can prevent the conflict if you can. If you can't prevent the conflict, then at least you can detect it early and maybe you can treat it preemptively. And if you can't prevent or detect the conflict early, then at least you should develop effective treatments for more advanced conflicts. And so what does this mean in COI? Well, you can avoid COI, you can declare COI, you can mitigate COI, or if all else fails, you can monitor COI to prevent adverse events. Okay, so what about prevention? Well, one stance you could take is never engage in activities that generate conflict. Just completely avoid it in the first place. The problem is that, as we all realize, it's very difficult or impossible in academic medicine and research. And in fact, I would argue, if you're not involved in conflict generating situations, then you may not be doing important and influential work. So I think everybody's doing important and influential work. It probably means you have conflicts, whether or not you're recognizing them. So if we all have conflicts, then what is the preemptive treatment for a conflict? Well, the first thing is to obtain prior approval. I've just put up here the ways to do that at Fred Hutch in the University of Washington. And if you're at Children's, I'm sure there's a mechanism there too. And interestingly, if you're at Fred Hutch and also have an appointment at UW, you have to do them both. They're not the same process. You also have to declare your conflicts. So even if you have prior approval and then you do that consulting or you're part of that startup or whatever, then you have to declare your conflict. And you do that through your annual institutional disclosures. And you also have to do that with each activity. And I will caution you to beware of different rules. Unfortunately, there really is no standard. And sometimes you have to declare things that are 2 years old or 3 years old or directly related or everything or at a certain amount. There is no standard. And so just be sure you read what that disclosure form says very carefully. And so I would suggest that as part of preemptive treatment, you're organized so that you don't forget any and you have all this information readily available to you in all different ways when you need it. And so this is just how I keep my spreadsheet. I have the year, I have the organization, the subject, the nature of the interest, whether or not travel was involved, whether or not hotel stay was involved, my start date, my stop date, the amount, and any notes. And it sometimes is important the number of nights that you spend away on something. I also distinguish between whether I'm site PI, overall PI, co-PI, co-investigator, whatever that is. And this way, if someone says, well, I want the past 3 years instead of the past 2 years, you have it readily available. So whatever system you use, just be sure that you are diligent about keeping it up to date. Okay. So you have conflict of interest. It's important enough to do both whatever you're conflicted with and whatever academic responsibility you have. So now you have to treat it. What can you do? Well, you can eliminate the conflict if they're in direct conflict with each other. That could mean divestiture if the financial conflict of interest, or maybe you have to be removed from the protocol or at least step back. You might have to modify your research plan, move to a different, move your study sites to a different institution or different population. You might have to replace personnel. Almost always there's a clause in there about public disclosure. You might have to disclose actually to your clinical trial participants, and there may be monitoring by independent reviewers. These are all mechanisms that you can use to mitigate a conflict. Okay. You can also get help. I would suggest that you follow all your institutional policies. They really are designed to keep everyone out of trouble. I'm also going to tell you about a conflict disclosure management system called Convey. It's something that is nationally available and maybe will be more used in the future. And then I'm also going to talk about the Sunshine Act or the CMS Open Payments Program. So what is Convey? Convey is what we wish would happen and everybody would use, I would say. And I'm not to say this particular system, but just something that is standardized across the country, across institutions, so that we can all report to one place and not do it over and over and in different ways to different places. So Convey builds itself as a global disclosure system. They think big. And it was developed by the AAMC after a request by the Institutes of Medicine, which is the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, in 2012. Because of that report by the National Academies, they really did recognize that there needed to be a national system that would cover everything and everybody. And so the way that this is set up is that it's designed to serve the needs of scientific journals, institutions, and continuing medical education programs. So the funding for this is supposed to come from the journals, the institutions, and the CME programs, not from the individual investigators. So if a journal wants to participate in this, then they would sign up and obviously pay for it. They would set their policies and instructions. They would decide which data elements they wanted to collect. They would ask any additional questions that they wanted. And then the investigators would put their information in. And the way this is designed is that once you put your information in, hopefully it can be sliced and diced for any other journal or institution or CME program that comes along and wants to have your conflicts of interest. And so, as I mentioned, a few select journals and other places are using them. I know some people who have put their information in here and they were expecting it to be worse than it was, and it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but it can take a long time. And the hope is that if more people use a system like this, and we all agree, then it would definitely streamline things. Okay. Well, what is CMS open payments? This says, well, yes, there's conflicts and there's prior approvals and there's people doing all sorts of things, but what really matters is who pays how much to whom. And so the open payments program was mandated by the Affordable Care Act of 2010. And what this says is that drug and medical device companies have to report their payments to physicians starting in 2013. So there are now years of this available. It includes all the fees for consulting, for travel, food and beverage, research funding, and actually, as I found out, the value of study medications. Individuals are given the ability to review and to dispute these, and then they become publicly available, and you can look up what any physician or any institution has received. There are some gaps, however, in this program. It does not report on subcontracts, and many companies are exempt. So unless you are interacting with Medicare, Medicaid, or CHIP, you actually don't have to do this. As I said, there's years of this, and they haven't really enforced it in any way, but the first enforcement judgment was at the end of 2020, when there was a $9.2 million fine to Medtronic. So there is the possibility that they're going to start truly reviewing these and auditing them. Interestingly, just starting in January of 2021, now all the payments to physician's assistants, nurse practitioners, and clinical nurse specialists also needs to be reported in this system. So this is what the website looks like. You can basically put in any physician or teaching hospital or company, and I just thought I would show you what mine looks like. So here I am. I'm listed through University of Washington, and you can see that there is the, oh, my arrow's not working, the year, the payment type, the company making the payment, and the nature of the payment. So here in 2020, I had $835,000 in associated research funding. So what does that mean? And so you get lots of information. So I'm just showing you again what my 2020 funding was. And you can see that a lot of that came from AstraZeneca, from Pfizer, and a little bit from Cadman. It also gives you the funding stream over the past years, so you can kind of see from 2014 on. And then actually down below is all of the actual dollar amounts. So it looks like I got a huge amount of research funding. But actually, I will say that that payment of $500,000 was actually for study drug. So I have a multi-center trial with AstraZeneca, and I am the lead institution. And so all of the money for the other sites and all of the cost of the drug actually goes into my personal associated research funding. So I think there are some, issues still with the system, but this is no doubt casting light on something that had been in the dark before, which is why this is called the Sunshine Act. What about general payments? You can see that I didn't get any general payments in 2020, but I actually did get about $40,000 in 2017. What was that about? Well, this is, again, all publicly available, but you can see that about a third was consulting, about a third was travel and lodging, and about a third was services other than consulting. And you can actually see all the companies and what they were for and for how much and what date it was, all the way down to food and beverage for $70. So, I think that this system does have the potential to increase transparency, to make people more accountable, and to hopefully avoid, unknown conflicts of interest. Okay, so now I just want to go through these 10 examples, and I think we're doing pretty well on time. And so we'll have lots of time for question and answers at the end. So I just picked out these examples of things that I've seen or that I've been involved in that kind of illustrate the principles that we've talked about. So let's talk through these. So the first one is uncompensated service on the board of directors of a nonprofit institution. So what does this mean in terms of conflict of interest? Well, it's uncompensated, so there's no money. It's a nonprofit, which is much better than a for-profit. A nonprofit does enjoy some exclusions. It's the board of directors, however, so it's a leadership role. And so this is the kind of thing I think that would be approved, but that would need prior approval because it is that conflict of commitment. There's going to be time involved. If it's uncompensated service, but you actually have to fly someplace for the meeting, then that actually does count as compensation and would need to be reported as a monetary amount. What about a situation where you want to be the site PI or a co-investigator of a clinical trial that's using a treatment for which you hold intellectual property rights? Can you do that? The bottom line is no, you actually cannot do that. Intellectual property rights are one of those prohibited financial interests. And so you're not allowed to be the site PI or really a co-investigator. You're not allowed to consent patients to figure out if they're responding. And that's because if the trial looks really good, people could look back at that and say, well, you actually have a conflict of interest because you stand to gain because of those intellectual property rights. What about a consulting fee for advising an investment fund about trends in the field and use of a specific drug? Is this a conflict of interest? Well, I will say that there is some writing out there that this is not a conflict of interest. You're certainly being paid, but is this have the ability of biasing you in some way? Not exactly clear in this particular activity. Nevertheless, this would need to be approved by your institution beforehand because it is a consulting fee, it is time. And I think that there is some concern that even though you would have to monitor yourself, depending upon the questions that they ask. There would be some opportunity for you to share some information that may not be publicly available, and that could be jeopardizing some of the IP of your institution. So this is a situation which does need prior approval and that you do have to be a little bit careful of. What about an honorarium and travel for a 30-minute scientific talk at an international meeting? Well, that is an honorarium and travel, so you do have to get prior approval for it. It's something that your institution wants you to do, right? Giving an international talk is obviously a great thing. I'm sure it would be approved, but you also have to pay attention because it's an international meeting. And so that foreign entity piece of the conflict of interest also comes in. So they'll want to know, what country it's to and who's involved in paying for it, and things like that. And so that would require prior approval. This is exactly the kind of thing that people forget to seek prior approval for. You go and you do this, and then you realize afterwards, that's not optimal, but it is okay. And you do have to file it even if and ask for prior approval, even though you've actually already done the activity. What if you have 50,000 founder shares in a company that's sponsoring a phase 1 trial? Well, first of all, that would be great because that means that you're translating your work into a phase 1 trial. But as a founder or as a co-founder, there are other specific restrictions, and you would not be allowed to do anything for that phase 1 trial. That founders and co-founders are particularly could be particularly benefited by a positive phase 1 trial, and so that would likely be viewed as a conflict that could not be mitigated. What about participation in a virtual SAB, which is a scientific advisory board, to develop a clinical trial where the honorarium is declined or paid to your institution? Does it matter? Excuse me. I will say that we as clinical investigators get asked to do this a lot. It is something that I think is important because you have the content expertise. You can make sure that the trial is designed well, but it is, of course, a conflict. If you were paid more than $10,000, then you would not be able to be the site PI. So if you were paid $5,000, excuse me, and then had to, say, travel internationally to be part of the scientific advisory board, that could easily get you over the $10,000 limit, and then you wouldn't be able to be the site PI. So you have to pay attention to it. But I think it is important to participate in these things. It's just going to be a conflict. Okay. What about if you assign a graduate student to a project that uses technology which is licensed by the PI to a for-profit company? Often these are really exciting projects. It's something that graduate and postgraduate students want to be involved in, but there are some extra things that you have to pay attention for. And a lot of times there is a conflict management plan in place for the PI that's designed to protect the interests of students and trainees. What could go wrong in this kind of a circumstance? Well, one is that maybe the great discoveries happen, but the graduate students are not allowed to publish them because there are patent or other kinds of for-profit interests. That could be harmful for the graduate student. Or maybe they wouldn't be allowed to hear, to know certain information that would be helpful for them. Not saying that this is necessarily going to happen, and graduate students and postgraduates and other trainees can participate in these things. They just have to know that there are sort of extra layers of protection on top of it. What about owning $20,000 of stock in a big pharma company that is sponsoring a clinical trial for which your patients are eligible? Well, actually owning $20,000 of stock, so this is not in a mutual fund, this is actual stock in a big pharma company, actually makes you ineligible to be the site PI of that study because the value of your stock could be influenced by the outcome of the clinical trial. You also have to be careful because, in terms of managing the patient, in terms of figuring out whether they're having a response on study, that can also get a little bit complicated. So $20,000 is, of course, not that much, but sometimes people have a lot more stock in things, and it can raise more alarm bells. So again, beware of ownership and human subjects research. What about use of a medical writing service to write a paper that is reporting clinical trial results. I would tell you that almost all of the pharmaceutical studies that I've been involved in now involve medical writers. I think they realize that it takes academics a long time to write this. And so these writers at least put together the first draft. That actually is not okay if it's not acknowledged and they're not, it's not transparent what's going on. It is okay if everything is above board and transparent and acknowledged. And actually, the cost of that medical writing service will be listed as a transfer from the pharmaceutical company to the investigators. They just take the amount and they divide it by the number of investigators. And that is actually allowable. And so this is my last example. What about at a program meeting, you propose a session on your research topic and you suggest your mentee, who is now at another institution, as a speaker? Is that a conflict of interest? Well, it actually is a conflict of interest. It's not a financial conflict of interest, but it's a personal conflict of interest because you are promoting the career of your mentee. And what I've often seen people do is say, I would like to propose so-and-so, full disclosure, this person was a mentee of mine until this date, and then go ahead and make the proposal. So it is a conflict. It should be acknowledged. I think it can be mitigated, but it is important to make that announcement. I think we've also seen people who make statements and don't have those kinds of disclosures. And I think sometimes the reputation and what you're saying can be questioned. And so it's just better to disclose if you think that there might be a potential conflict. Okay, so general principles. I would say that conflict of interest is unavoidable. However, conflict of interest does not preclude participation in research, clearly, and openness and disclosure helps protect all involved. However, not all COI can be managed, and we reviewed the ways that conflict of interest can be handled. Okay, so here are just some references for Fred Hutch. I'm just showing you some of the policies and some helpful FAQs. Similar thing for the University of Washington, there's a policy. And then also very useful if you're interested in more case studies is this AAMC AAU Advisory Committee. Almost the second half of this document are different kinds of situations, very believable that one could be involved in, and it just sort of goes through how the conflict of interest was handled. And so I spoke very quickly. We have lots of time. I'm happy to take any questions, and if we finish early, that's wonderful too. So thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. There are some questions. Let's see, and people have even upvoted, which is fantastic. So the first question is, when enrolling subjects in a clinical study with higher reimbursement is a conflict of interest, what is that higher reimbursement relative to?
That is a great question. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. I was talking about, let's say you have 2 or 3 clinical trials open, and one is a very lucrative reimbursement because it's a difficult clinical trial. And so as an investigator, you get a lot more support than an academic, within your local institution study in which there's very little support. That can be motivating to some people. And I think as an investigator who finds myself in that situation, it's very important to not let the finances of a clinical trial, push you one way or another. You really want to think, what is that patient eligible for, and present all of those to them. And that's what I try to do. We try to screen them for all of our studies and let a particular patient know all the things that they're eligible for, and then to help them decide. But you can see how that's conflict of interest, even though you don't let that influence your behavior.
Thank you. Let's see. Can you have a conflict of commitment if you are involved in a startup company as a graduate student?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. There's obviously that 10 or 20% rule about how much time you can be spending on your outside activity. And so I think for startups, sometimes that definitely is more than the 20%. You can also argue the conflict of commitment comes in with that issue of focus. How much are you going to be doing your graduate studies if you have this other for-profit entity that you're working on? So I definitely think that can be a conflict of commitment, and how great it is certainly depends on the particular circumstances.
Thanks. All right. The next question is, if the NIH holds the intellectual property rights for a new drug, can they sponsor or run a clinical trial? And then they give an example, VLP technology for HPV vaccine and phase 3 HPV vaccine trial run by the NCI.
Well, I think they could. I mean, there's obviously NCI investigators who discover things there, and NCI has mechanisms to run trials. I guess the issue is, would they want to do that? There's a lot of stuff that NCI is not necessarily, or CTEP is not very good at doing. And I think that was the problem why we have the Bi-Dole Act, is because there was a lot of stuff that was sitting around that was not being commercialized and was not getting out to the community. So I'm not an expert in the NIH and NCI, but I imagine they could be involved in that. Obviously, they have been involved. They've been involved in some of the COVID vaccines and other things. So.
Let's see. Next question. For guideline generating bodies, how are members with clinical practice handled? A guideline that reduces screening has an impact on their practice. Is it only researchers with funding from for-profit sources that are considered conflicted?
Yes, it usually has to do with actual income from companies. So that would be if you served it on an advisory board or as a consultant or had, actually research funding per se usually goes to your institution, not to you individually. So it's viewed as not quite as a conflict as if you actually were on, a scientific advisory board for the company. And so I'm most familiar with my American Society of Hematology guidelines panels. And in those, no more than 50% of people can have any conflict. So if you went to one advisory meeting you were already at a conference and you went to dinner and they paid you $500, that would actually put you in the category of a conflict and you might get kicked off the panel because of that. So you do have to be careful. But no, it's not, it's a little hard to police the conflicts that one has with your own personal beliefs and experiences. Although one of the things I've tried to emphasize to the talk is that may actually bias your behavior more than the $500 that you got for the dinner in which they ask you a few questions. So, but it's obviously harder to track those sorts of practice biases and experience biases.
Okay, thanks. So next question is, are conflicts of either interest or commitment a bigger problem for clinical research involving patients than for basic bench science?
I think practically that probably is true because there's that whole human subjects issue, which a lot of bench and even translational work don't have to deal with, right? If you're dealing with animal models or cells from patients, but not the patients themselves, then you don't have that whole human subject slant to it. On the other hand, some of the financial conflicts of interest clearly are pertinent to both. I think conflict of commitment is definitely relevant to both. But practically, we sure deal with it in clinical research. It's because it comes up very frequently because the nature of our experiments are with humans.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is writing papers with a previous supervisor on some previously done work a conflict of interest?
Maybe the person could put a little more details into that in terms of conflict of interest. It would be a conflict of interest. The NIH would consider that a conflict of interest. If you publish someone, then that's considered a conflict. Sometimes people do look at your recent co-authors for some things. I can see how it could be some conflict of interest in terms of, biases and other sorts of things. But I'm having a hard time thinking. It's certainly not a financial conflict of interest and not a conflict of commitment.
And then the next question, which might be the last one unless somebody else asks a question, which you're welcome to do so. Generally, do you need to disclose all COI for all projects or just ones for which the subject of the COI conflicts with that subject of the project?
So that's a great question. And again, that's why I say read the fine print about what they want. Sometimes it is just you know, things that are pertinent. So a lot of journals are like that. You know, is there anything that is directly related to the, you know, the topic of the paper that you're submitting? I would say other things like sometimes CME and other things, they want everything that you've ever done, even if it's not really directly relevant. So I would say I've seen both of those things, and you just have to read the fine print to know what they want.
Yeah, okay, thanks. We have a couple more questions. When a principal investigator excludes postdocs in his or her patents to start a startup company, can this be considered a conflict of interest or an unethical action?
Excludes postdocs. So I think that what this person is saying is they should be on the patent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think that that gets more into the, you know, issue of the ethics and that sort of thing. I mean, conflict of interest, I guess, would be the interest is excluding other people from your patent. That is a conflict of interest. It's not how we typically think of it and how we typically police these. But obviously that's a conflict. A conflict because it's a conflict between two people.
How I've seen that resolved is going to the tech transfer office and talking with them and working it out. What, you know, how does the ownership on the patent work? Okay, next question. Is it a conflict of interest if a clinician with a certain credential or specialty is studying outcomes of care from other clinicians with that specialty or credentials?
Like if I were studying outcomes in transplant, I guess is an example. I don't think of that as a conflict of interest. I mean, I guess it could be in the sense that you want a certain outcome. You know, you don't want to prove that what you're doing is incorrect. I think we all have that bias, or we have to acknowledge that there could be that conflict. But I don't think it's inherently a conflict if you study what you know and your field. Outcomes is obviously very you know, important, but also that's why I think that what the issue that question raises is that you want to be sure that when you have your result, it's believable, not only to, you know, the journal and the publication, but to your field, so that you actually are doing something that moves the field forward. And if you appear majorly conflicted, if you reject information that is counter to your hypothesis, if you're not circumspect about your conclusions, you will get a reputation of not being objective and not being a robust scientist. And I think that could hurt you and that could hurt your field.
Thank you so much. I am not seeing any other questions coming in at this time. Let me just double check. Oh, here comes one. Okay, so oftentimes the people who are best positioned to review a grant or manuscript are also direct competitors with built-in conflicts. Does avoiding COI in such cases by recusal diminish the overall quality of peer review?
Well, inherent in that question is yes, of course it does, because those people know the field very well. So you're obviously balancing getting an objective review with getting a quality review. And you know, where you exactly draw the line. The NIH obviously has pretty stringent requirements about that in terms of you know, direct conflicts, or if someone has a company, you know, that sort of thing. They are less good about the personal side of it. You know, if someone has had a past conflict or they are direct competitors in something, you know, if this person doesn't get the grant, but someone else is more likely to get the grant. You know, I think the same thing comes up in terms of journal articles. I mean, you know, grants are sort of the most obvious one because there's a single time, there's a single score, and that gets decided. But you know, who speaks at a conference? You know, who's on the program committee and who gets selected? I think what we have to acknowledge is that there are these kinds of biases in almost everything that we do, and that we have to acknowledge it in ourselves. We have to feel comfortable calling it out when we see it in other people, and you know, trying to maintain that balance, and so that we do kind of have the highest standards that we can have despite all of this. But I think your, you know, guidelines panels are the same way. You know, people who are well funded to do research is usually because they're disease experts, because they have a lot of experience, because they're well respected in the field. Those are exactly the people that you want on a guidelines panel, because they know all the literature. And I think when these rules came out, there was some perception in the clinical sciences that sometimes the guidelines panel were you know, mostly composed of people who were very junior, who didn't always have that sort of perspective. So I fully acknowledge the tension there between these issues.
All right, I am not seeing any other questions at this time. Maybe we'll give just a 20, 30 more seconds to see if any other questions come up.
Although we can end early, Karen, because I like to finish meetings early.
I'm just checking the chat box. There's no questions there. I think the questions are done. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you giving your fantastic talk today and helping our trainees learn more about conflict of interest.
Thank you. I really had a fun time. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Bye.